There were not many white Christmases in our part of Wales in my childhood. Perhaps one or two. But Christmas cards, Dickens, Dylan Thomas, and wishful memory have turned them all into white. I don't know why there should have been so few in such a cold, wet land. The nearness of the sea, perhaps. The Atlantic, by way of the Bristol Channel, endlessly harried us with gale and tempest. Perhaps our winds were too wild and salty for the snow to get a grip. Perhaps they blew the snow over us to the White Mountains and Snowdonia and England. Most of the Christmases of my childhood seemed to be the same, but I remember one in particular because it had departed from the inexorable ritual. On this eve of Christmas, Mad Dan, my uncle, the local agnostic, feared for his belief but revered for his brilliantly active vocabulary in the half-alien English tongue, sat in our kitchen with a group of men and with biting scourge and pithy whip drove the great cries of history, the epoch-making, world-changing ones, out of the temple of time. They were all half-truths, he said, therefore half-lies. I sat and stoned raisins for the pudding and listened, bewitched, to this exotic foreign language, this rough and riddled, rolling, multisyllabic English. There is only one Christian, and he died upon the cross, said Nietzsche, said Dan. Nietzsche? I thought Japanese. Perhaps he can speak Japanese. It was said that he knew Latin and Greek and could write both of them backwards. Can you speak Japanese, Mad Dan? Shut up, Solomon. Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, irresponsible rubbish. Cries written by crabbed fists on empty tables from mean hearts. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. What's that, I said? Latin, Copperfield, meaning it is sweetly bloody marvellous to die for your country. Man is born free and is everywhere in chains, golden-tongued, light-brained, heedlessness of consequence. I think, therefore, I am Descartes. French, I said. Right, Seth. Thou shalt have a Rolls Royce and go to Oxford and never read a book again. Out of the welter of names, the cries, the quotations, the references rolled endlessly. He said that Martin Luther should have had a diet of worms. Why, I thought, why should the man have to eat worms? Can you eat worms? I said. Not as readily as the worms will eat you. He roared with delight at this incomprehensible joke. He had become more and more burning and bright, and he said he had a cold and took some more medicine from a little bottle in his inside pocket. Well, this was as it should be. Uncle Dan had always been talking ever since I could remember, until that moment Christmas was Christmas, as it had always been. And then my sister's husband, cheekboned, hollowed, sculpted, came into the room. All right, lads, he said. Off you go and take the boy with you. Where to? I said. Just go with Dan and behave yourself, he said. Where's my sister? I said. Never you mind, he said. Go you. So I went out into the night with Mad Dan and the other men. Why was I being sent out at this time of night on a Christmas Eve? My mother had died when I was 2 years old, and I lived with my sister and her husband ever since. I'd had lots of Christmases since my mother's death. They could be relied upon already. They had always been the same. There was the growing excitement of Uncle Ben's Christmas Club. You paid in sixpence or a shilling a week throughout the year. And the choosing from the catalogue. Littlewood's catalogue. There was the breathless guessing at what Santa Claus would bring. What was in those brown paper parcels on top of the wardrobe? Would there be a farm with pigs in a sty and ducks on a metal pond, 5-barred gates, metal trees and Kentucky fences and a horse or two and several cows, and a tiny bucket and a milkmaid and a farmhouse complete with red-faced farmer and wife in the window and a chimney on top. But, pray God it wasn't Tommy Elliott's farm, which I had played with for over a year, and which I feared from whispers that I'd caught between my sister and Mrs. Elliot was going to be cleaned up and bought for me a second-hand present. Everyone would know. Then I'd spend an hour or two singing Christmas carol duets with my friend Trevor door to door, picking up a penny here and a halfpenny there. And then home at 9 o'clock, perhaps to gossip with my sister, eat some more nuts, and to be sent to bed sleepless and agog. And now, at that very time of getting to bed, I was being sent out into the night with Mad Dan and his audience, all of them with Christmas colds, and all of them drinking medicine out of little bottles kept in their inside pockets. We went to the meeting ground of that part of the village. It was called the End. Vacant stretch of stony ground between two rows of cottages. The miners had built a bonfire and stood around it, burning on one side and frozen on the other. Chestnuts, and because there'd been a plenty of work that year, potatoes were roasted to blackness and eaten, sprinkled with salt, smoky and steaming straight from the fire. And Mad Dan, making great gestures against the flames, told the half-listening, silent, munching miners of the lies they had been told for thousands of years. Turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek, boys, and get your bloody brains broke. Suffer, all my children. This side of the river is torment and torture and starvation. And don't forget the sycophancy to the carriaged and the horse, to the dame-led, the bare-shouldered remote beauties in many mansions gleaming with the gold we made for them. Suffer, all my baby men. Beat out with great cold hands the black melancholy of the hymns. When you die and cross that stormy river, that roaring Jordan, there will be unimaginable delights, and God will wipe away all tears, and there will be no more pain. Lies, lies, lies. And I was getting on. Christmas was nearly here. Dan was boring now and was repeating himself. What was in those parcels on top of the wardrobe? And why had I been sent out so late on a Christmas Eve? I wanted to go home. Can I go home now, Mad Dan? Shut your trap and listen, or I will have you apprenticed to a haberdasher. Haberdasher. Fate worse than death for a miner's son. There was, you understand, the ambition for the walk of the miner. Corduroy trousers, with Yorks below the knees to stop the loose coal running down inside your boots, or the rats running up inside your trousers and biting your belly, or worse, and the lamp in the cap on the head, and the bandy, muscle-bound strut of the lords of the coal-face. There was the ambition to be one of those blue-scarred boys at a street corner on a Saturday night with half a crown in the pocket and secure in numbers, whistling at the girls who lived in the residential area, the doctors, the lawyers, the headmaster's daughters. Dan rode on. He said he believed in nothing, he believed in everything, he knew nothing, he knew everything. He was the Voltaire of Aberavon, and he wept once or twice. The silent miners chewed and stared uneasily. Crying was for women, or preachers talking of God's magnanimity. Miners did not weep, even gabby miners like Mad Dan, who evaded work whenever he could. Mad Dan, with passionate eloquence, had long been an advocate for frequent and lasting strikes. Life was just too rough to cry about. I tried to sneak out of the circle round the fire, but one of the miners grabbed me by the ear and brought me painfully back. "You go home when we go home," he said. The wind, tigerish, now crouched, now circled, now menaced the bonfire, and the bonfire rearing back from and roaring back at the wind sent showers of sparks and smoke and coloured flame up the open, empty chimney of the night. I was bored and confused. What did Mad Dan mean about cries being lies? And his cries didn't even sound like cries to me. They sounded like sentences. His cries were screams when somebody twisted your arm or busted your nose. How could turn the other cheek be a cry, or God is love, or the wages of sin is death? I dimly guessed what time in mist confounds. And how could the 23rd Psalm be a poem of incomparable beauty? One of the teachers at school had said that it was. It doesn't rhyme. How can it be a poem if it doesn't rhyme? And how can something be a half-truth? And why were cries lies? And why couldn't I go home? Why was I being kept out on a Christmas Eve when Holy Santa was due at any time after midnight? I dimly guessed what time in mist confounds. Why had my sister been upstairs all the night long on a Christmas Eve when I was home? Why wasn't she peeling potatoes or something? Why were two of my aunties sitting in the parlor? Why did they talk low? I dimly guessed. Was my sister dead? Dying? I loved my sister, sometimes with an unbearable passion. Suddenly I knew that she was dying. Is my sister dying, Mad Dan? We're all dying, Nebuchadnezzar. Even your growing pains are reaching into oblivion. She'll last the night, Dyfrig, she'll last the night. My sister's no ordinary woman. No woman ever is, but to me, my sister less than any. After my mother's death, she, my sister, had become my mother and more mother to me than mother could ever have been. I was immensely proud of her. I shone in the reflection of her black-haired, green-eyed gypsy beauty. At her work, she sang at her work in a voice so pure that the local men said that she had a bell in every tooth and was gifted by God. She had eyes so hazel green and open that to preserve them from too much knowledge of evil, they should have been hooded and vultured, and not as they were, terrible in their vulnerability. She was innocent and guileless and infinitely protectable. She felt all tragedies but her own. I had read of the Knights of Chivalry, and I knew that I had a bounden duty to protect her above all other creatures. And it wasn't until 30 years later when I saw her in another woman, and realized that I had been searching for her all my life. Why had I been kept out? When would they let me go home? Mad Dan was silent now, his stoned eyes staring at the fire. Let's have a song, boys. Stay me with minims. Comfort me with crotchets. And the crag-faced miners sang with astonishing sweetness a song about a little engine. Croshaw Bailey had an engine. It was filled with mighty power. He was pull a little lever. It was go 5 miles an hour. 5 miles an hour. Was you ever see? Was you ever see? Was you ever see such a funny thing before? They sang a song about what you could see from the hills of Jerusalem, about a green hill far away without a city wall, of a black pig, and of how necessary and how dreadful it was to kill it, of the shepherds and the magi. Mad Dan stared, and I sang soprano. There was a disturbance in the fire's night wall, and my Aunt Ginny stepped suddenly into the light. Mad Dan stood up. All right, he said. Lovely, she said. £9. A girl. Come, Joseph of Arimathea. Santa called early tonight. Let's go home. We took a few steps, and then he stopped and he called out, any of you lads got a piece of silver to the miners? One of the men threw him a florin. Tell her it's a happy Christmas from Nat Williams and all that. And we went home. My brother-in-law was whistling at the hearth, with the flat iron and the nuts working steadily. My Aunt Ginny and my Aunt Cassie were arch and coy, and spoke to me as if I were demented and slightly deaf. Santa Claus has brought Richie Pitchy a prezzy-wezzy. Now go upstairs and see what Santa's brought you. And I went upstairs with Dan. And I dimly guessed, of course, but still, there might have been a fire engine, loud, red, and big enough for an 8-year-old to ride in. The prezzy-wezzy was a red-faced, wrinkled, bald old woman, 60 minutes old. Dan put the florin into the palm of the baby's hand. Ooh, she's got a good grip, he said. She'll never be poor. My sister looked washed out and weak. I gave her a kiss. She said, what do you think of your Christmas present? Fine, I said. Is this all I get? No, she said. There'll be more in the morning. Okay, I said. Good night then. Dan and I went downstairs. And the baby screamed. "Now there," said Dan, "is the only cry that is true and immortal and eternal from the heart." "What do you think of your new sister?" they said in the kitchen. "New niece," I said. "Fine." And I went to my bed in the box room. My brother blew out the candle. "Sleep now," he said. "No lighting a candle and reading." So I pulled the clothes over my head, made a tent, felt for my Woolworth's torch, and with John Halifax, gentleman, propped against my knee, I began to read. The Atlantic wind from the Americas whooped and whistled round the house, and the baby choked with sobs on the other side of the wall. Well, I thought, at least it isn't Tommy Elliott's farm.